Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Well, hello again, and welcome back to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, where I read to you, and I will be continuing on a Friday read, as this is episode 80. So, let's get into it, and I shall be continuing with the new book of etiquette. So, I'm going to hop into it, and in this section, we will be learning about introductions. The introduction is a social device for placing two or more people on a friendly and comfortable basis. To introduce correctly is more than a matter of form. You must be able to create an immediate friendliness between people who are meeting for the first time. You must be able to lead these strangers into a smooth and pleasant conversation. Only a clumsy introducer will exchange names and permit an awkward pause to follow. A scientist and a student meeting in your home for the first time might be introduced in this manner. Mr. Rogers, may I introduce Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown is matriculating at Columbia this year. This leads the young man and the older man gracefully into a conversation concerning various studies, and they feel at ease in each other's company. Of course, a great deal depends on the strangers themselves. If they are friendly and cordial, conversation will move forward, and there will be no awkward, embarrassing pause. To introduce them skillfully and draw them at once into conversation is to give them a pleasant opening. For all ordinary occasions, the correct form. For all ordinary occasions, the plainest and simplest form of introduction is best. One may say, Mrs. Johns, may I present Mrs. Brown? Or Mrs. Johns, Mrs. Brown. The second form is less formal. The word present is not expressed, but it is understood. A younger person is always presented to the older or more distinguished, but a man is invariably presented to a woman, no matter what the difference in age may be. The exception to this rule are when a woman is introduced to the President of the United States, to a cardinal, or to a reigning sovereign. The correct introduction of either man or woman to the President is, Mr. President, I have the honor to present Mr. or Mrs. Brown. To the Cardinal, the introduction would be, Your Eminence, may I present Mrs. Brown. The introduction to a king or queen is very simply, only the name of the individual being presented is uttered. The person making the introduction simply says, Mrs. Brown. When two women are introduced, the younger is presented to the older. If Mrs. Brown is an elderly woman and Mrs. Smith a recent bride, the correct introduction is, Mrs. Brown, do you know Mrs. Smith? Or Mrs. Brown, this is Mrs. Smith. An unmarried woman is always presented to a married woman in this manner. Mrs. Brown, may I present Miss Smith? Similar distinctions are made when introducing men. The younger is presented to the older, the unmarried man to the man who is married. Where there is no difference in age, title, or dignity, the best form of introduction is Mr. White, Mr. Brown, with no particular emphasis on either name. Some special introductions. When introducing a highly distinguished man, a mother would present her daughter to him in this fashion. Mr. Harris, my daughter Ellen. But to a young man she would say, Mr. Harris, have you met my daughter? If the daughter is married, she says, my daughter, Mrs. Johnson. Do not use Mr., Mrs., or Miss in introducing members of your family, if you can possibly avoid doing so. A husband, a wife, a son or daughter, a brother or sister can always be spoken of as such. For example, a woman introducing her husband to another woman would say, "Mrs. Harris, may I introduce my husband?" A daughter introducing a young woman to her mother may use either of these two forms. "Mother, may I present you Miss Harris?" or "Mother, Miss Harris." A young man might be introduced in this way. "Mother, this is Mr. Johns." Incorrect forms of introduction. There are several forms of introduction in popular use that are in poor taste and should be avoided. They are awkward, unpolished, and show lack of social distinction. The phrase, "let me make you acquainted with," should never be used, nor the phrase, "I want you to shake hands with." No well-bred person uses the word meet in making introductions, as for instance, "Mrs. Brown, meet Miss Smith." Nor is it a correct form to say, "Mr. Jones, Mrs. Smith." "Mrs. Smith, Mr. Jones." It is quite enough to mention each name once. It is extremely bad taste to use the phrase, "my friend," in making introductions. If you introduce one person to another, call one of them your friend. You imply that the other is not. Group introductions. A person is never introduced to a group on a formal occasion when a great many people are present. At a small luncheon or dinner, the hostess introduces her guests individually to one another, but at a large ceremonious luncheon or dinner, she introduces only those who are nearest. All those who meet under a friend's roof are automatically introduced, and it is quite correct to talk to neighbors at table, whether formally presented or not. On informal occasions, a newcomer may be presented to a small group of people, instead of to each person individually. The form would be Mr. Jones, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Frank, Mr. Brown. If there are women in the group, it is better form to make the introductions individually. Under no circumstance is anyone ever led around a room and introduced to various groups of people. When to introduce. Never introduce people to each other unless you are quite certain that it will be agreeable to both. If two young women of your acquaintance have been attending the same church for several years and neither greet nor recognize each other, you may assume that they wish to remain strangers. A wise plan is never to introduce unless it is necessary to do so. There are various social occasions that demand proper introductions, and these we shall presently discuss. But for the moment, let us concern ourselves with those occasions when an introduction is unnecessary. In the street, for example, introductions are rarely made. Let us pretend that you are walking in the street with another man, and you chance to meet a young woman who is an acquaintance of yours, but a stranger to your companion. You raise your hat and greet her, and your companion raises his hat as a mark of courtesy and politeness. But you do not stop to make introductions. Even if you do stop for a brief moment, you do not introduce your companion. But if the young lady joins you and walks on with you, an introduction becomes necessary. If two young women are walking together, they meet a third who stops to speak to the one with whom she is acquainted. The other walks slowly on. She does not stand by awkwardly waiting for an introduction. The newcomer should remain but for a brief moment, or if she is asked to join the group, they walk on together. Overtake the girl who has walked ahead, and introductions are made. A newcomer should never join a group unless invited to do so. The necessary introductions. Listed here are the occasions and circumstances that require introductions. You should always introduce two people who express a desire to meet each other, guests at a small luncheon or dinner, and guests at a house party. Partners at a large dinner. If this introduction is overlooked, the people sitting next to each other at table may introduce themselves. The woman says first, "I am Mrs. John, Kendricks. The man replies, "How do you do, Mrs. Kendricks? I am Harris Smith." The fellow players in any game, such as the four who are at the same bridge table, the man or woman who is a stranger in a small community, the friend one brings to a club, the friend for whom one has asked an invitation of the hostess. Here, the correct form of introduction would be, "Mrs. Harris, this is Mr. Brown. You said I might bring him this evening." A newcomer at a place of business, he should be introduced at once to all who will be his immediate associates. When the name is not heard, it is not good taste to ask anyone point blank what his or her name is. If the hostess does not pronounce the name clearly, and you are not sure whether the newcomer's name is Miss Davis or Miss Harris, avoid mention of the name. Or, if you wish to know the young lady's name, it is perfectly admissible to say, "I'm awfully sorry, but did I not hear your name clearly? Or did Mrs. Roberts call you Miss Harris? I'm sorry, I did not hear very well." Do not attempt to guess at a name that is not heard distinctly. It is much wiser to ask to be correct than to guess and be corrected. The indirect introduction. There are occasions when it seems desirable to make an indirect introduction. The purpose of this type of introduction is simply to include in a conversation someone who has been left out, or someone who has just arrived. For instance, Dr. Brown is giving an informal chat on a subject in which everyone is interested. Mr. Smith arrives late, and he is a stranger to Dr. Brown. The hostess does not break off the thread of the conversation to make formal introductions, but says, "Do go on, Dr. Brown. I am sure Mr. Smith will be tremendously interested in what you are saying." Of course, this is correct only at a small gathering. If there are many people present, not even this indirect introduction would be made. Later in the evening, perhaps, the hostess would present Mr. Smith to Dr. Brown. The hostess at a large dinner or luncheon often makes use of the indirect introduction to draw her guests into conversation without stopping for formalities. Thus, while conversing with one guest, she turns to another and says, "Mr. Jones, Mrs. Smith was just telling us about the famous picture that has been brought to America. Have you seen it at the museum?" The guest addressed joins in the conversation, and the hostess's purpose is achieved. The acknowledgement. Unless one knows precisely what to say when introduced, there is likely to be an embarrassing pause. Generally speaking, the simplest and most natural thing that occurs to your mind is the best thing to say if it carries with it a note of cordiality. All formulae are stiff and stilted. The following forms will help you to know what is correct and what is incorrect. Add the tone of cordiality, the word or two that it takes it out of commonplace, and you have a graceful, courteous acknowledgement. The formal greeting or acknowledgement is, "How do you do?" Sometimes the name is added. "How do you do, Mrs. Brown?" If Mrs. Smith were introduced to Mrs. Brown, it would be Mrs. Brown who would say, "How do you do?" A hostess rises to receive all introductions and to greet all newcomers. She offers her hand to both men and women, but a woman guest remains seated when introduced to a man, or when she is one of a group to which a woman guest is presented. She rises when greeting her host or the hostess, an elderly or distinguished man, a guest of honor, an elderly woman. A gentleman always rises when introduced. If the introduction takes place in the street, he lifts his hat and bows slightly. To another man he offers his hand in greeting. Occasionally, a hostess will unknowingly introduce each other two men or two women who have been for a long time on unfriendly terms. Under such circumstances, the tactful and courteous thing to do is to nod and say, "How do you do?" as though you were a stranger. This will avoid embarrassment to everyone concerned. It is not necessary to remain nor converse with the person to whom you have been introduced. Correct and incorrect forms of greeting. Under no circumstances is it correct to say, "Pleased to meet you." This phrase, though popularly used, is in poor taste. For a cordial, informal acknowledgment, one might say, "I am delighted to know you," or "This is indeed a pleasure." It is not so much what you say as how you say it. These two phrases, if repeated in a parrot-like fashion, sound stilted and unnatural, but give them the proper tone of cordiality. Let them be accompanied by a gracious smile and a warm handclasp, and you have the ideal acknowledgment, particularly if you follow immediately with a remark that opens up an interesting conversation. If you have been looking forward to an introduction, if you have heard, through friends in common, about a certain man or woman, it is correct to say, in acknowledging the introduction, "How do you do, Mrs. Blank? I have been wanting to meet you for some time." If Mrs. Blank is a sort of celebrity in her own particular social circle, the phrase, "I have heard so much about you," may be added. But such greetings are not in good taste when addressing a person of note, such as a famous artist or a celebrated musician. The greeting should be simply the formal "How do you do, Mr. Roberts?" The stiff formal bow has disappeared with the high handshake and the low curtsies of the grandmother's days. Today, the correct bow is simply a nod of the head and a genial smile. When a stranger is presented to a group of guests already assembled, his bow should include the whole company. Taking leave. When parting from a new acquaintance with whom you have been talking, observe these rules. If you are a man, do not offer your hand to a woman unless she makes the first move. Rise when she rises. If you are a woman and you have been talking with a man, you may simply nod, smile, and say goodbye or good night. If you wish to be more cordial, offer your hand and say, "Goodbye, I am very glad to have met you." While it is perfectly correct for a woman to use this phrase, it is better taste for a man to avoid it. For the man to say goodbye, "I am very glad to have met you," is regarded as somewhat a presumption. He should wait until the woman has expressed her pleasure before he expresses his own. If you are a young woman who has been introduced to an elderly woman, wait for her to make the first move at parting. If she offers her hand, you take it. If not, you do not offer your own. It is good form to rise for an elderly woman, but it is not necessary to rise when a woman of your own age takes leave. If your conversation with the elderly woman has been particularly interesting, she may say, "Goodbye, Miss Blank. It has been a great pleasure to meet you." Your response should be cordial. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts." When taking leave of a group to which you have been presented, it is not necessary to bid each one goodbye separately. A cordial goodbye or good night, with a smile that includes everyone, will suffice. No one ever leaves a dinner party or reception without taking leave of the host and the hostess, but it is not necessary to seek out each person to whom one has been introduced and bid him or her a separate farewell. Business introductions should always be brief and concise. When taking leave of someone to whom you have been introduced in business, say, "Glad to know you." If the meeting has taken place in his own office, you may say, "Delighted to see you." Never use the word "delighted" unless you are quite certain that the introduction has been as pleasing to the other person as it has been to you. It is poor taste to linger after you have indicated a desire to leave, just as it is poor taste to keep someone standing in conversation after he or she has expressed a desire to leave. When you are ready to go, take your leave quickly, briefly, but not in a manner that will seem curt or rude. Take your leave in as courteous and cordial a manner as you know how, and go. Well-bred people never embarrass others and themselves by long, awkward leave-takings. Future recognition of an introduction. The broad general rule to remember is that the first intimation of recognition comes from the woman to the man, from the higher in rank to the lower, from the older to the younger. For instance, Mr. Roberts was presented to Miss Blank at a dinner. They were not partners at table, and they did not talk together. At the home of a common friend, they meet again, and it is Mrs. Blank who smiles in recognition and says, "How do you do, Mr. Roberts?" She does not cross the room, however, but waits until she is near enough to greet him. Mr. Robert nods in recognition and replies, "Delighted to see you, Mrs. Blank," or more formally, "How do you do, Mrs. Blank?" He does not offer his hand, but takes hers at once if it is offered to him. The privilege of continuing or ending an acquaintanceship rests with the woman. That is why it is not considered good form for the man to make the first sign of recognition. This applies, however, only to the first meeting after an introduction. Thereafter, common sense becomes the better part of etiquette, and the man and the woman greet each other cordially, simultaneously, without thought of precedence or rule. It happens occasionally that two people are introduced for the second time. If the occasion is a formal one, they should acknowledge the introduction with a cordial "How do you do?" and not attempt to make explanations, as this would be embarrassing to the person making the introduction. But if the occasion is informal, the previous introduction may be recalled. Let us pretend that Miss Stone and Mr. Brown have already been introduced. They meet again at a dinner party, and Mr. Brown is presented to Miss Stone by the hostess. He says, "I believe I have had the pleasure of meeting Miss Stone last week." And Miss Stone replies, "How do you do, Mr. Brown? I am glad to see you again." Perhaps Mr. Brown, to whom you have recently been introduced, incorrectly addresses you as Mr. Graham. You may say, "My name is Grayson, not Graham." Be sure that your manner is friendly and courteous, otherwise you may give offense. Remember always that what you say depends for its effect upon the manner in which you say it. Introduction by letter. No one asks for a letter of introduction except from an intimate friend, and then only when the occasion warrants it. People who go from a small city to a large one, who go abroad for a season or visit a new part of the country, who through circumstances find it necessary to find the acquaintance of someone in business, such people may ask for an intimate friend to write the necessary letter of introduction. The friend who recognizes the need for such a letter will not wait to be asked, but will offer it. It is not only bad taste, but unethical to introduce by letter an individual of whom the writer knows little, or toward whom the writer is not especially friendly. It is also bad taste to ask a letter of introduction from a person who is a mere acquaintance, or whom one has not known very long. The letter of introduction is more binding and entails more obligation than the ordinary introduction. That is why one should hesitate to ask for it, and why one should be sparing in one's offers to write them. If you have a friend who is going to a distant city, or a strange place where you have other friends, and if you are quite certain that it will be pleasant and agreeable for them to meet, you may offer to write a letter of introduction. The letter itself should be brief, concise, and free from matters of personal or private interest. See chapter on social correspondence. It is usually written in the presence of the person who is to be introduced, and is always handed to him or her unsealed. The person who receives it thanks the author and seals it in his presence. Letters of introduction are usually presented in person, but frequently they are left with the personal card. The latter form is better, for it for it obviates that awkward ceremony of handing a letter to someone who is a stranger to you and standing by in silence while it is read. A man with a letter of introduction to a woman goes to her home immediately upon his arrival in her city. He leaves the letter with his card at her door. A woman with a letter of introduction to another woman calls at her home and leaves the letter with her own card. A woman with a letter of introduction to a man does not call, but sends the letter to him by mail, including one of her own cards. Letters of business introduction may be given much more freely than letters of social introduction. If you have a letter of business introduction, whether man or woman, you go to the office of the person indicated and send in your card and the letter. You remain in the reception room until the person to whom the letter was addressed sends for you. If you receive a letter of introduction and for some reason do not present it, you must make some explanation to the friend who prepared the letter for you. Acknowledging the letter of introduction. The written introduction entails definite obligations. A woman who has received such an introduction from another woman either calls and leaves her card in acknowledgement or invites the newcomer to her house. If it is impossible, because of illness or other matters, to honor a letter of introduction, a prompt and courteous explanation should be written to the bearer of the letter. It is also necessary, in this case, to write to the author of the letter. A man who receives a letter of introduction from another man calls him on the telephone and invites him to his house for dinner or to luncheon at his club or hotel. If the man receives a letter of introduction from a woman, he may call upon her at once and ask her to join him at afternoon tea. Sometimes he arranges a dinner party and invites many of his own friends, doing everything possible to make the stranger's stay in the city interesting and pleasant. But the bearer of the written introduction must not expect too much attention. He or she must remember that the person who receives the letter is not away from home, but right in the midst of all his accustomed duties and occupations, and may find it inconvenient at that particular time to give the newcomer a great deal of attention. Sometimes an acquaintance may be made possible through a letter of introduction grows into sincere friendship. It is always nice to remember the common friend who was the author of the letter and write a note of thanks. And that is the end of introductions in the new book of etiquette by Eichler. So, if you found this educational, inspiring, or uplifting, would you leave me some comments down below? And what do you think about how introductions were made back in the day? Or what do you think of the way etiquette works now and how we have changed since then? I look forward to hearing from you. So, I'll see you next time. Have a good evening, everyone.